Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth. And today I'm finally getting around to continuing the Van Bruggen response. I know it's been a while. For some reason these things just seem to take a while to prepare. But for those of you who may be coming in on the middle of this, I don't know, this is a part of a series of responses to Dr. Van Bruggen, who is a proponent of what is called the majority text, and specifically the majority text of the New Testament. He, in fact, has written a book called The Ancient Text of the New Testament. And it's a very, very, very thin little book, not very big at all. And what we're doing here is we're going through that book. It's broken down into 5 sections, and so I'm making 5 video responses to each one of those sections, and I'm responding as I go. I'm not trying to get ahead or anything like that, just responding as I go. And I present his material first, what my best understanding of his argument is with the page references, so you can check on it if you want to. And it is not, by the way, a very overly expensive book. It's like somewhere between like $6 and $10 on Amazon, so not very expensive at all. Alright, so what I first do is I present his perspective, at least as best as I can determine it. And like I said, I give you the page numbers, so you can go ahead and check that if you wish. And then after I give his take on things, I respond to it from the critical text position. And then at the end of that, I go ahead and present basically a positive case for at least particular elements of the critical text and the position of people who advocate the critical text over the majority text when it comes to the New Testament. And so with that in mind, we'll go ahead and we'll get into this real quick, real soon. But before we do that, I did want to reiterate some things from the first video. First of all, this is not as big of an issue as some other areas are. That is, this is not something that generally tends towards the extremes that some things that have to do with the text do. For example, majority texters are not King James onlyists. They're not single language version onlyists or things like that. They just happen to believe that the form of the text that's found in the majority of manuscripts is what should be used as a basis for translation. So they don't have a lot of those cultic tendencies. They don't have a lot of those very, very, very what ultimately winds up being very self-centered ideologies that show up in things like KJV onlyism or Latin onlyism or Septuagint onlyism. There's various onlyisms that have happened throughout history, and fortunately majority texters are not necessarily on that same playing field. I'm sure there's some of them that are pretty extreme, but by and large it's mostly just this is what we think we should use as the basis for translations, rather than some of the more recent Greek New Testament based texts that have come out. Also, by and large, majority texters will actually have really similar doctrine and theology, at least when it comes to a lot of the major issues. They're generally speaking, as long as they're actually faithful to the majority text itself, they're still going to wind up being Trinitarians. They're still going to believe in the hypostatic union. They're still going to believe that we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, by Christ alone, as revealed in God's Word alone, unto the glory of God alone. All those kinds of things are going to be intact, and so we actually have a very great amount of overlap in what we believe, and it's not necessarily something that really should divide people out in terms of church worship and those kinds of things. We are the majority text church. We are the critical text church. That's not what I'm advocating at all. This is a discussion that needs to be had, I feel, and get it out there and open and get at least the ball rolling, and that's why I'm starting with Van Bruggen. He's one that a friend of mine who is on the other side of this issue suggested to me. So I'm taking it from there, and we'll go from there and see where it ends up. But my hope here is to start the ball rolling on this conversation with the understanding that we're all ultimately on the same side here. We're all Christians. We're brothers and sisters in the Lord, in so much as we hold to those essentials, and we ought to treat each other like that. But part of treating each other like a brother and sister in the Lord is that when you have a disagreement, you are honest about that disagreement, that it's actually there. You are clear about that disagreement. Here's what the actual points are. And you're also willing to listen to what the other side has to say and engage in real meaningful dialogue between the two sides. And like I said, that's what I hope this particular video series will start. We'll get people talking, and not talking past each other, but actually talking to each other and figuring out what the real issues are. Alright, so with all of that being said, let's go ahead and get into responding to Dr. Van Bruggen. Is the majority text the right text? Part 2, which I'm going to call A Historical History. Exactly why that is, we'll see here in a second. Alright, so as I said, I break these things down into 3 basic sections. First, we're just going to go over Van Bruggen's position. In this particular case, he's going to be talking about recension-based reasoning for rejecting the majority text. What exactly that means we'll get into here in a second, but if you watched the last video, you already know where that's going. That is, there were textual scholars in the past who are on the critical text side, who are on my side rather than his, who proposed that there was this recension of the Greek New Testament text that resulted in the majority text. And that's why we shouldn't trust it, because it's the result of this recension. And so Van Bruggen is going to respond to that claim. And then, after we go over his discussion of recension-based reasoning for rejecting the majority text, I'm going to interact with his claims. And then finally, we're going to go over textual criticism for the believing proponents of the critical text, part 2. Covered a lot of the basic groundwork last time. Here we're going to get into a couple of fairly specific, 2 major specific points that really need to be driven home, I believe. And so we will start with that. Alright, so section 1, Van Bruggen's reaction to recension-based reasoning for rejecting the majority text. And so for this section, I'm going to do my best to try to present the argument as Van Bruggen would. Now, obviously, this material is old, and so some of it's out of date. Van Bruggen isn't here to represent himself, and so that's definitely a little bit unfair on that. And also, of course, I'm on the other side, so I'm going to be a little bit biased. So keep all of those things in mind as we go through this section. But as best I can, I'm going to try to present the arguments as I understand that Van Bruggen would present them. Alright, section 1, Lucianus did it. Van Bruggen's first main point in this second section of his book is that there is no concrete historical evidence for a single recension of the New Testament text that led to the majority text. Okay, and you can find that on pages 17 through 19 of his book. And how does he support this claim? He says there's no evidence for a recension. If you are rejecting the majority text because there is a recension, well, that's a stupid reason because there is none. How does he support that? Well, he first points out that it has been posited that Lucian, who died in 312 AD, created the recension that led to the majority text. And this is not at all false. This is very much so true, that there were textual scholars who put forward Lucian as being the guy who created this recension that eventually led to the majority text as we now have it. And interestingly, in at least the major literature that I've seen, and Van Bruggen obviously would agree with this, it's only Lucian that's ever been specifically implicated in doing so. So here, there's these people in history who have said, well, we can't trust the majority text because it's the result of a Lucianic recension, a recension made by Lucian. But there's a problem. When studies have been done concerning Lucian's supposed revisionary work, they haven't turned up anything of note. There's, a phrase here and there in this particular source that mentions Lucian and what he's doing, but there's nothing that is ultimately concrete in the historical record that says definitively that Lucian actually did make such a recension. And outside of the historical record of what was actually claimed about Lucian, there's nothing in the manuscripts themselves that would suggest a single recension leading to the majority text. And because of that, at the time that Van Bruggen was writing this, there were a lot of textual scholars that were in the process of abandoning the idea of a recension. That is, at the time that Van Bruggen was writing, there was material that was out that was common. Some of it was saying, okay, here's the Lucianic recension, idea. This is why we reject the majority text, is because of this, da 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 da. And then there were other things that were coming out at that time that were saying, no, that's not the reason why we reject the majority text. Instead, they would use different terminology. Instead of saying specifically that it was Lucian, they would speak of the framers, plural of the text, and talk about having multiple sources. And so Van Bruggen is simply pointing out that, this idea is already on its way out. So if that's the reason why you reject the majority text, everything, all the concrete evidence that we have is saying that didn't really happen. So if that's your reason for rejecting the majority text, tough luck. Just doesn't hold up. All right, and then his second main point in this particular section of the book is that the majority text tradition itself does not show evidence of being the result of a single recension. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, as I mentioned earlier, everyone, not everyone, but there were definitely people who were blaming Lucian for the majority text, saying that Lucian is the one who basically created it. And as I also mentioned, when we look at the manuscripts themselves, they don't seem to show the evidence for actually being the result of one archetypical manuscript. And this is what Van Bruggen puts out. He specifically pulls in from scholars that have done some work in this, such as von Soden. And if I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize. I'm terrible with names. But von Soden discovered various tendencies and layers in the majority text that could not be explained as arising from a single archetype. So at the time that Van Bruggen is writing this, he's got a hold of fairly scholarly literature that's saying, with the level of complexity that we see within this textual tradition, it's really, really, really unlikely that it had a single source. Okay, it doesn't come from one single point, one single archetype that overrules it all. And von Soden was not the only person who noticed this. There was also Lake and Colwell. I think I've heard some people pronounce it Cowell. I'm going to say Colwell. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But Lake and Colwell concluded that the majority text manuscripts are a collection of converging textual traditions rather than varying reproductions of a single archetype. So Van Bruggen points out that, there's a lot of people who have been actually looking into the majority text itself and trying to understand where it comes from and what it is. And it doesn't seem like it's the result of a single recension. Either when we look at the history, as far as Lucian is concerned, there's nothing in the history about Lucian that actually conclusively points to him making a recension of the New Testament text. And then on the other side, there's nothing conclusive in history, not in history, but in the manuscripts themselves that point to them definitely being the result of a single recension. So in the manuscript evidence and in the general historical evidence, there just isn't any support for this recension idea. So at this point, Van Bruggen has basically destroyed the idea of a recension, and then he can go on to what he thinks the significance of this is. And so his third main point is that even though modern proponents of the critical text aren't greatly troubled by the idea that the majority text isn't the result of a recension, the fact that the majority text isn't the result of a recension does weaken the critical text position. So Van Bruggen admits that by this time that he's writing, and this was back in the 1970s that he's putting forward this material, he admits that by this time, the proponents of the critical text, such as myself, I wasn't there at the time, obviously, but proponents of the critical text are already abandoning the recension idea. And he notes that they don't seem to be greatly troubled by it, but as far as he can determine, it does weaken their position. And here's the ways in which it weakens it. First, now that the recension idea is basically being done away with, critical text proponents must now be able to account for how the majority text became generally accepted despite being secondary without the idea of a recension. So when the recension idea was in place, the idea was that basically Lucian came up with this text, and then the the church polity, the church politics, forced that on everybody else. So here's the official version that we're going to use, and you all have to do it. That was the idea behind the recension. So now, if the critical texters are still going to say that the majority text should be treated in a secondary fashion, that it isn't the primary guide as to what was original, then you need to explain how it became so popular, despite not being original, without the idea of official recension being forced on people. How do you get it becoming so popular without the recension? This creates a hole, as far as Bruggen was concerned, in the critical text position. If you're going to treat this text as secondary, you need to explain why it's still secondary without a mechanism for it to become popular. At least that was his thinking on it. And then the critical texters, such as myself, also needed to explain the convergence of the majority text, because the recension idea, it predicts a deterioration. That is, there's a single archetype, and then copies get made off of that archetype, and those copies will contain some errors. And so now there's these body of copies that have errors, and copies get made from them, there's more errors. And so if there was a single archetype with all the copies going back to that, you'd expect the errors to compound, and you'd expect them to diverge more and more and more from each other. And that's what a recension would imply, but that's not what we see in the majority text manuscripts as we go down through time. Instead, they're converging, they're going in the opposite direction. And so he says that's certainly not what the recension model predicted. It predicted that they would get further and further apart. And you guys need to be able to explain how this works. If your position is going to actually hold any water, it needs to account for the facts. And then he goes on and says that the majority text position explains this convergence, where the manuscripts are getting closer and closer to each other rather than further apart. He says that we explain it this way. This is our explanation for these facts. The facts don't fit the recension model, but they fit our model because we think this is what happened. And so he goes forward and he puts what he thinks happened. He says this growing conformity rather points in the direction of a simultaneous turning back in various centers to the same central point of the original text. In the 4th and following centuries, this text was sought for in the oldest and most faithful manuscripts, and people conformed to it after centuries of textual disintegration. And the primary material for this quote, it comes on page 21, and I included some information from page 20 in the brackets, especially the bottom bracket. The first bracket was basically just to make it fit well, because originally he didn't explain what this was. He just said this rather points, and so I filled it in to what he was talking about beforehand. I don't know how you guys are, but when I read brackets inside of a quote, I'm always wondering where they came from. And so I'm telling you, because the bracketed words are supplied. The first bracket, I put in the growing conformity because that's what he was just talking about, and so I wanted to include that in there. And then the second set of brackets is including material from page 20 that was relevant to our discussion here. So what is he saying? He's saying, well, we're experiencing this convergence. The manuscripts are getting closer together, not farther apart. And so what he says happened from a majority text point of view is that, early on in the manuscript tradition, there was some degradation. And historically, that does make sense. Early on, there was, of course, the non-piece of the church. Early on, Christianity was very much so a persecuted religion, first persecuted by the Pharisees and then by the Romans. And the early Christian scribes were frankly not overly careful. A lot of them were not trained as scribes. They were just doing the best they had with what they had. And so you get a lot of variation in the first few centuries. In fact, most of the variation that we have for the New Testament text comes from the earlier period rather than later periods. Most of it is contained there. And so what Van Bruggen is saying is, well, there's this period of textual corruption that goes on, where you get all of these groups that are doing their own thing as best they can, but they're not trained scribes. They make some mistakes, quite a few mistakes actually. And then after this period ends, after this period of persecution comes to a halt, the Christians can finally relax. They can breathe. They can take the time to do things and do things right. And so he's proposing that in the 4th and following centuries, because that's when this persecution came to a formal end, was at the beginning of the 4th century. Some people put the dates in different years, but a lot of people would say that it was in 313 that it happened. A declaration that came out from Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire saying, we're not going to persecute the Christians anymore. And actually it technically included a few other groups, I believe, as well. But the main thing from a Christian point of view is, hey, we're not going to be persecuted anymore. And so at the beginning of the 4th century, you have the beginning of a period of peace, and Van Bruggen is proposing that the Christians, now that they're in this period of peace, they decided, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to do this right. And so they go back to the earliest forms of the manuscripts that they have, and all these groups, all these different Christian groups are all doing this basically around the same time, reaching back to the oldest manuscripts they have available to them in each of their areas. And then that is what creates the majority text going forward. So you have all these different areas all going back to old manuscripts at the same time, and it is that that winds up through history creating the majority text. All right, so as near as I can tell, that is Van Bruggen's position in the second part of his book. And of course, my bias is going to be evidence, and like I said, there's also issues of history. This is a book that is really outdated because it was written back in the 1970s, and in textual criticism, a lot has changed. One of the biggest changes, and I talked about this in the last video as well, is the idea of CBGM, the coherence-based genealogical method that is very much so computer-based. That is, a lot of the data from the manuscripts, complete collations of all the manuscripts that we have available are being fed into computer systems, and we're using that to track how all the various manuscripts, whether they be majority-type manuscripts or non-majority-type manuscripts, relate to each other. And that has really changed the face of New Testament textual criticism to a great extent. Now, there's particular aspects of that model that people who know me know that I'm suspicious of, particularly the standard of coherence itself is somewhat problematic because one of its fundamental assumptions is that variants will tend to travel together, which to a certain extent is true. But in the case of certain variants, that is probably much less true. And it basically has to do with how notable a variant is. The more notable a variant is, the less likely it is going to travel passively with other variants. You're going to run into issues of preference in the scribes when you come to really notable variants. And so the idea of coherence, I think it works for the vast majority of variants that are in the New Testament, but when it comes to some of the more particularly famous ones and the ones that would tend to cause the most reaction among folks, I think that it's definitely a faulty standard. But it'll still be interesting to see what comes out of the system and be able to go from there. And I'm very, very, very happy about the fact that they are making stemmas for the New Testament manuscripts so you can actually see how they map to each other. And this one seems to be prior to this one, but not prior to this one, and they can relate them all to each other. Really cool thing. And they're not completely formal stemmas. They're not saying that this manuscript is the direct ancestor of this one. They're just saying as far as general relatedness is concerned. So there's, like I said, there's my bias in reading Van Bruggen stuff. There's also historical issues that a lot of what he said has actually already been addressed by now. All those kinds of things. And so I don't want it to seem like I'm picking on Van Bruggen. It's just a point to start the conversation. So with that said, let's go ahead and actually react to what he said here. So his first main point was that there's no evidence for a single recension of the New Testament text that led to the majority text, and that is actually the critical text position right now. We generally agree with that, and that is why you have seen in especially recent decades a much greater willingness on the part of critical text advocates such as myself to be at least willing to consider majority text type readings. Now, to make a little bit of a differentiation here that hopefully will be helpful later on, when you say majority text, you're a lot of times people are talking about basically counting noses. You know, there's 500 manuscripts that read this way, there's 499 that read this other way, so we're going to go with the 500. That's majority text. When you talk about things historically, though, it's a little bit easier to talk about text types. And when you're talking about the majority text, the text type that it falls in, the manuscript tradition that leads to that majority of readings, is called the Byzantine text type. And so sometimes in this presentation I'm going to say Byzantine text instead of majority text. That's why it's more or less the same thing, but the Byzantine text refers to the whole textual tradition and not just the final count at the end. Alright, so sometimes I'll use that. I'm just warning you ahead of time. But getting back to the points, what Van Bruggen pointed out back in the 1970s has become pretty standard fare now, even among critical text proponents such as myself. We agree that there is no evidence of a single recension, and what that means is that it is very possible that some of the Byzantine readings, some of the readings that are in that general tradition that led to the majority text, that some of those in fact could indeed be very ancient and could indeed be very authentic. And some of the more modern critical texts that have been put out there have actually included some of those Byzantine elements in them. And I talked about that quite a bit last time. Let's see his supporting evidence. We already talked about the issue with Lucian, and he was not wrong about that. You know, Lucian is the guy who's been blamed for all of this. And by the way, I know I spell it different ways, Lucian or Lucianus, and that's because the sources talk about it diversely. When you talk about people's names from other languages getting transposed over into English, and sometimes through a mediating language, the form of the name will sometimes change a little bit, and so I bounce around a little bit just because I'm used to seeing it in different ways. I apologize if that's distracting. But Lucian, Lucianus, however you want to say it, both are perfectly acceptable. It's two different forms of the same name. But yeah, there was a historical Lucian that did exist, but there's no concrete evidence that he actually created a Lucianic recension of the New Testament. Completely agree with him on that one. And then, yeah, scholars abandoned the idea of the recension because there just simply wasn't any evidence for it. And so, yeah, I agree with him on that one. There's not a whole lot to respond to there. He was dead right about that. That's, yeah. All right, and then when Van Bruggen moves into the points about the textual evidence itself. Okay, so the historical evidence says, you know, yeah, there was a guy named Lucian, but there's no evidence that he actually ever made a recension of the text. True. When he gets into talking about the textual tradition itself, which I would call the Byzantine text type and the Byzantine tradition, he makes some admissions that are actually really interesting to me from the modern critical text perspective, because this is kind of a linchpin for the modern critical text position. Because, yeah, we admit it wasn't the result of recension, but it is a convergent textual tradition. And this was the evidence that Van Bruggen brought in. He brought in von Soden and Lake and Colwell. Like I said, some people pronounce it Cowell. I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. But he brought in these scholars and said, these guys are saying it doesn't come from a single source. And so there's multiple bases here. It's multifocal, multiple origination points. And he admits that it is a converging textual tradition. Like I said, this is actually a major point in the critical text position, and yet Van Bruggen is using it for his own side. Now, at the time that Van Bruggen was writing this, this would have gone against a lot of the established orthodoxy of the time, and I get why he was using it at that time, but now he's kind of shooting himself in the foot. And even at the time that he was writing this, honestly, and I don't mean to be mean to Dr. Van Bruggen at all, but even at the time that he was writing this, I don't think he really understood exactly what the other side was saying. And because this seems to be a point of confusion, it does bear a little bit further examination. All right, so let's look at that specific point in a little bit more detail. What do we mean when we say that the majority text manuscripts are a set of converging textual traditions. So we talk about the Byzantine text type as a whole, the Byzantine tradition as a whole, and what early people like Lake and Cowell, or Colwell, however you want to pronounce it, were saying is that these are converging textual patterns. What were they saying? What were they meaning? What they were basically saying was this, is that the Byzantine text tradition begins with manuscripts that are relatively unlike the Byzantine text or the majority text as we would define it today. And gradually over time they became more and more and more like that. So just to make things simple, we're going to start off with a diagram here. Okay. Let's say that these 4 ovals here, well, not technically ovals, ellipses, these 4 ellipses right here represent 4 different streams of transmission. And this is going back to the earliest manuscripts that we see Byzantine elements in. And I'm using the word element very intentionally. These are not Byzantine manuscripts. These are not manuscripts that would have all of the readings that the majority text eventually would have, but here and there in certain places, or sometimes just one small part, they will have a Byzantine element. So they'll have a Byzantine reading here, and sometimes there'll be a short section that is Byzantine in character. But when you look at the manuscript as a whole, it's decidedly not Byzantine. In fact, it's non-Byzantine more often than not. So just for purposes of illustration here, we'll say that the lowercase letters represent a Byzantine variance, not necessarily Byzantine text, of course, but a variance, one particular element that is Byzantine. And then the uppercase letters will be non-Byzantine variants. And in the earliest period that we can go back, going through the Byzantine text family, the further back we go, the wider and wider and wider it gets. That is, and specifically the more unlike the Byzantine text it becomes. Early on, the earliest texts that we have that have Byzantine elements, they're not technically Byzantine, but they have a few Byzantine elements here and there. These ones, by majority, are non-Byzantine. They have Byzantine elements, but they're by majority non-Byzantine. Okay, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about converging textual traditions. The early forms are more unlike what we get down at the end. So when I think of manuscripts that are in this category that have Byzantine elements but on the whole are not Byzantine, I think of manuscripts like P45. P45 is actually a very early manuscript. Second, perhaps late, not late, but second, maybe 3rd century. Very early manuscript. And it has some Byzantine elements in it, but of the whole, it's non-Byzantine, taken as a whole, but there are some Byzantine elements in it. And we do have these in history where there's some early Byzantine readings that would become popular on down the road. And what we're seeing as we go on to the next step in the transmission sequence, going to later manuscripts that are still a part of the Byzantine textual tradition, what we see is these separate traditions that all tend to be fairly idiosyncratic, but decidedly non-Byzantine. We start to see them interact with each other. So take the top 2, for example. These are different streams of transmission right now, and this would be more or less in the period of Roman persecution. You've got all of these different groups with these different texts, and like I said, the early Christians, when they're making their texts, they weren't usually professional scribes, usually didn't have a lot of time to work on it, make things nice, neat, and pretty, and yeah, mistakes were made and variants crept into it. But on the whole, they have a non-Byzantine type of text, but as time went on, these separate and different groups would start interacting with each other. And when they would interact with each other, their texts would also wind up interacting with each other. And you would get those, what was 2 different textual traditions converging into one. So taking the top 2 here, you have a little a variant, one of the Byzantine types readings, and then a bunch of non-Byzantine readings, B, C, and D, capital B, C, and D for non-Byzantine. And then in the next group over, maybe the church in the next town or whoever it happened to be, when these two groups start interacting with each other, they're going to get a little different form of the text. In the next group over, it's mostly non-Byzantine, capital A, capital C, capital D. There does have one Byzantine element, and these two groups are going to start interacting with each other. And when you have groups that are interacting with each other, bringing these variants together, but still having to interact, they're still going to wind up having to use something. They're not going to use both of these at the same time. Instead, the traditions are generally going to combine. And sometimes you'll get active decision making on the part of the scribes. They're okay, you've got this group over here and this group over there coming together, and we'll sit there and compare manuscripts, and they'll to come up with an official version for all the groups to use that are now together. That sometimes happens, and sometimes you get them making official decisions. Okay, we like how your text reads here, we like how our text reads here. Sometimes you get that happening, but the vast majority of the time there isn't a lot of active decision making that would happen. Usually what would happen is you get these different groups that exist that kind of have their own genesis and their own history, and they've already kind of got an established pattern of the way they do things, especially an established pattern of the way they do things in the church. And that established pattern of the way they do things, and especially how they incorporate the text into their normal worship services, that's called a liturgy. And each of these groups initially, when they're interacting with each other, they would have their own liturgies. And in their own liturgies, they would have their own set of texts that they would emphasize. So for example, in the first group, where they have this Byzantine reading, that might be, say, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew. And in liturgies, things that were officially read during the church service, things that were incorporated as a regular part of the church service, the Gospels would show up pretty frequently. But not necessarily every part of every Gospel. Usually at particular parts they would use this Gospel, and another part they would use another Gospel, so on and so forth. And so let's say the first group there, they have a variant in Matthew. And it happens to be a Byzantine variant. Good, bad, or indifferent. It's just the reading that they happen to have. And the other group, well, they don't typically use Matthew in their liturgy very much, but they do use, say, Luke. And in Luke, they happen to have a Byzantine variant. And so when these two groups get together and they form a combined liturgy, they're going to say, okay, at the times where we use Matthew, we're going to use the group that already is using Matthew. We don't use Matthew so much, so we'll just go with your text. But we use Luke all the time, so we'll use ours. And so the resultant combination of those two textual traditions, without any active decision making, is just use what you got for your part, we'll use what we got for our part that we're used to. When that all combines and coalesces, you wind up with those Byzantine elements being fused together. So now, the new tradition in Matthew has a Byzantine element and a Byzantine element in Luke, whereas the traditions earlier on were separated out. What has happened is it's become more Byzantine. And this isn't the result of any active decision making. People saying, well, I happen to like this reading better than the other. Sometimes that did happen, but most of the time it's pretty passive. It's, okay, you're using that. Okay, we use this over here. We combine the two. When we use Matthew, it's your guys's. When we use Luke, it's ours. And it just so happened that within this particular overarching tradition, that it happened to tend in this particular direction. So for these first two groups, you might have a more Byzantine version of Matthew and Luke. Other groups that are going to be interacting, and sometimes they'll interact beside each other, you're going to get similar combinations. That's what a converging text is. It's taking on those elements that were initially rare are becoming more common. So initially, most of the readings weren't Byzantine. But as we go further on down the trail, we start seeing manuscripts that have quite a bit more Byzantine elements to them. When I think of this particular level where there's a decidedly greater amount of Byzantine readings, usually we would wait for the percentage of Byzantine to non-Byzantine readings get a little higher before we properly categorize them as Byzantine. But when I think of manuscripts that are like this, that have a decent amount of Byzantine elements. I think of manuscripts like Codex Alexandrinus. Codex Alexandrinus is really interesting because it's Byzantine in the Gospels, but not in the other books of the New Testament that it has. And this makes sense. The Gospels were the books that tended to show up in the liturgies the most often. And so when groups would interact, that's where their interaction was, and those would be the things that would tend to coalesce. The other textual traditions, there usually wasn't a reason for them to coalesce because they weren't being actively used, at least not nearly as much. And so you would have basically free manuscripts running around of, say, the Pauline epistles or the general epistles, the book of Revelation. It kind of went off into its own little thing most of the time. But more common books, especially the Gospels, those ones are going to tend to coalesce much more often because you have a need for some kind of official version to be used during the liturgies. We're going to have to read something on Sunday morning, and we all know that we're going to read the Gospels more often than anything else, so there needs to be some official version. And the versions that we have here are not the same. They're going to wind up picking one or the other, which means that the other variant that was there in the tradition to begin with is going to be lost. So for the first two, they dropped the capital A and the capital B in the new tradition. This is just an example, of course, but they dropped the capital A, capital B. When the second and third groups start interacting with each other, and there's more official use that goes on, you have this interaction, and then you have official use that winds up cementing things. They wound up dropping the capital B and the capital C, and so on down it goes. And a lot of times, like I said, especially early on, this shows up first and foremost in the Gospels, and then it starts to make its way into the other books of the New Testament. But we see it first and earliest in the Gospels. But these manuscripts, like I said, there's usually now fairly large portions that have truly Byzantine readings in them, usually the Gospels. But the manuscript as a whole isn't completely Byzantine usually, like Codex Alexandrinus. It's just the Gospels that are that way, basically. And even that form of the text, though, it still isn't like the majority text that would wind up showing up later on down the road. For example, Codex Alexandrinus, as far as we can tell, didn't have the pericope adulterae in it, John 7:53 through 8:11. It didn't have it. In fact, the earliest versions of the Byzantine text that we have that are in that Byzantine textual family, they don't have some of those things that would become popular later on. They're still not the popular version of Byzantine yet, but we've got fairly large sections of them that are definitely showing more Byzantine tendencies than not. But these groups, of course, you now have the peace of the church, happened roughly in 313 AD, that are now interacting with each other more and more, and as they interact, the groups are going to wind up using something, and they're going to wind up picking something, usually passively. It's just a matter of, okay, you guys use that for this particular book, we use this version of the text over here for our book, and so when we come together, that's what we're going to do. We're going to use your text for yours and our text for ours, and put it all together, and we're good to go. And so you get this combination of tendencies. And an important thing to realize here is that these groups are not interacting with each other all at the same time. It's not like they're all just sitting in a line saying, okay, I'll share with you, and the next guy going down, okay, I'll share with you, and all down the line. It's not all at the same time. You have a couple groups, or 3 groups, or 4 groups, or however many groups interacting over here, and then you'll have sometimes just a couple of interactions, but way later, and a few interactions that actually occurred quite a bit earlier. It's usually pretty sporadic throughout time, and that's what actually winds up resulting in this combination of idiosyncratic things. And this is actually something that you can show mathematically. If you hold everything in a steady state, it's basically the same number of manuscripts that are being made off of each earlier generation of manuscripts, and the same error rate, so on and so forth, same combination features. What you'll generally get is about 50%, as far as the variants are concerned. You'll get about 50% of the variants being original and 50% being unoriginal. But if you vary those conditions, the manuscripts are not all copied the same number of times. Some of the manuscripts are lost in transmission. They are not copied anymore. There's disproportionate copying. Some of them fall out of use, and then there's preferred variants that show up. When you allow those kinds of variances to come into the model, you almost always tend away from 50% truth versus error. And that's why you see a collection tending in one particular direction, either good or bad, but it tends in one particular direction. But going back to what we see, we have early, you might call them pre-Byzantine manuscripts that will have a Byzantine element or elements here and there, but on the whole, they're not Byzantine. Then after some time, these groups have started to interact with each other, and now we start getting fairly large portions that are Byzantine. It's not necessarily the entire manuscript set of manuscripts yet, but particular portions, like Codex Alexandrinus. The Gospels are Byzantine, but the other parts, not so much. And it would usually be reflective of what was used in the church. When groups interact and they do things officially together, like in the worship services, they're going to have to pick something for that official use. And they might not be actively thinking, we like this better than that. It's just a matter of, we'll use what we got here and we'll take what you got over there and combine it together, and there we are. A lot of it is very passive, but also not necessarily good. Not necessarily bad either, but not necessarily good. And the biggest point, though, is that you are decreasing the overall number of variants that are available in each new line of transmission. Like I said, with the first two, they had the capital B variants and the capital A variants. When those two coalesced, though, they lost the capital A and the capital B. And the same thing goes for the other ones. They start losing variants as time goes on. And then on through time, these groups are still going to be interacting with each other. And now we've gotten to the point where we've started fixing the other parts of the text. Okay, so yeah, we don't use the Pauline epistles very much in the official services, at least by comparison to the Gospels. But we have started using them quite a bit now, and we've kind of developed a pattern, and so that'll wind up becoming fixed too. We're going to have to pick something, and you're not necessarily actively comparing manuscripts, but you're still going to have to pick something, and whatever you pick is going to wind up dominating the tradition further on down the line. And so the first and second groups in the second set of manuscripts, like I said, it doesn't exactly all pan out like this, but when their groups combine, you're going to wind up with only the capital D at the end being reflective of what we have most of the time in the early versions of the text. And then other ones you're going to lose other parts, but they're still going to be separate and distinct. And this is what Lake and Cowell and all these people were getting at, is that as we look at the textual tradition, we can see that the stuff at the end doesn't all come from the same place. There must have been a lot more input that eventually led into this, because their differences are in different places. It's not, okay, here's archetype, variant here, and branching out from there. Instead, it's tending towards one reading, and what you have is loss of material after loss of material after loss of material. And when we get to the manuscripts that, by and large, in multiple places where the vast majority of the text really could be classified as Byzantine throughout, I think of manuscripts like Manuscript G. They start showing the tendencies that would become fairly endemic of the majority text overall. And so Manuscript G, for example, which is a 9th century manuscript, like I said, P45, 2nd, 3rd century manuscript. Codex Alexandrinus is a little hard to date. Some people put it as early as the 4th century, some people as late as the 6th century. I'm personally okay with it being a 4th century manuscript, but to split the difference, we'll just call it a 5th century manuscript. Codex G is in the 9th century, and it actually starts to show some of those elements that the earlier properly Byzantine text didn't show. So, for example, Codex Alexandrinus, it doesn't have the pericope adultery in it. It doesn't have John 7:53 through 8:11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. But by the time we get around to manuscripts like Codex G, it does have it. There's been enough coalescing that that particular reading has now become fairly common. And then finally you'll get to some manuscripts, and there's not necessarily a ton of these, but there's a decent number of them, where you've got quite a bit of interaction, and it shows a very late form of the text. The form of the text that would actually become familiar to the reformers. And these ones tend to be a little bit idiosyncratic. So the mid-Byzantine texts that we just talked about, like Codex G, show a relative amount of independence. They're pretty distinctly Greek. There might be a few elements that come from other places, but much earlier on, for a while, they've been pretty much left in Greek hands. But the later Byzantine manuscripts, they're not necessarily like that, and this is something that we'd have to understand historically. In roughly the 14th century, people can always debate one side or the other as to when exactly something happened, but people will usually roughly say that the Renaissance got started in the 14th century. And the Renaissance was a revival of learning, and especially a revival of respect for ancient sources. And so during the Renaissance, people were much more interested in ancient sources and looking at things in their original languages and stuff like that. And that's eventually what wound up leading to the Protestant Reformation, was this renewed interest in source material. But at this particular time, there was only so much source material that they had available to them, and it was usually something that was roughly contemporaneous with them. So it'd be, at the start of it, would basically be the mid-Byzantine Greek manuscripts, but it would also be the somewhat later form of the Latin manuscripts as well. And during the Renaissance period, they tended to compare the Greek and the Latin a lot. And so what would happen is you'd have these Greek manuscripts that would be made, because they're still handwriting manuscripts at this time, but they're starting to compare things and be interested in things again. But there would be a lot of Latin influence on some of these manuscripts, not necessarily the whole. Some of them were still largely in Greek hands and maintained in Greek. But in the West, there was a lot of comparison and interaction with Latin texts, and so from time to time you'd actually see the Latin spilling over into the Greek a little bit. And when I think of those kinds of manuscripts, they're still considered part of the Byzantine tradition as a whole, but they actually don't have, but in some places at least, their readings don't actually match what the majority of Greek manuscripts as a whole have to say. And that's because in the 14th century, Renaissance gets started, they start looking at old manuscripts, but they also start comparing them and more or less combining them with some of the current manuscripts that they had. And so sometimes you get these conflated texts that have weird idiosyncratic readings. Manuscript 636 from the 15th century is an example of this. Manuscript 636, along with 7 or 8 other manuscripts, like I said, these ones that I'm thinking of in particular tend to be fairly rare. But along with 7 or 8 other manuscripts, happens to have a particular reading at 1 John 5:7 that none of the other Greek manuscripts have. Now, these manuscripts are a part of the Byzantine text tradition, but they've also had a lot of interaction with the Latin Vulgate at this point, and so they wind up having a reading that no other Greek manuscript has. And like I said, and what's interesting about this particular set of manuscripts that has this reading is called the Comma Johanneum, that talks about the witness of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and these are one, those kinds of things. A lot of people have pointed to it being a Trinitarian passage and a proof of the Trinity. In context, that's not actually what it's about. It's actually about unity of witness, not ontological unity. And so even at that, even if it was a true Greek reading, it still wouldn't actually be a Trinitarian text. But because a lot of people thought of it as a Trinitarian text, it was pretty popular. And this manuscript 636 winds up with that reading in it, just by comparison of the later Greek manuscripts, kind of like Codex G from the 9th century, getting compared with the late Latin manuscripts, and they kind of coalesce, and you get idiosyncratic readings here and there. And 1 John 5:7, where you have the Comma Johanneum talking about these three being one, the Father, and the Son and Holy Spirit, basically. I can't remember if the wording's as word instead of son, but where it talks about that, that is something that shows up just in 14th century and later manuscripts, ones that are coming out of the Renaissance period. And this is what we see when we look at the Byzantine textual tradition as a whole. Early ones have Byzantine elements, but on the whole are not Byzantine. We go a little bit further in history, and we'll see entire portions of the manuscript tradition, like say the Gospels, usually the Gospels, that are now decidedly Byzantine, but they still don't have all of the Byzantine elements that would become popular later on, like the Pericope Adulterae. But we see a coalescing of Byzantine readings, all these things that were separate and disparate elements beforehand, they get combined, and a lot of the earlier variants are now getting left off. And that's the problem with a converging textual tradition. Each time you get a convergence of the individual traditions that make up the overall tradition, you wind up losing variation within that. Like I said with the first two, it had the capital A and the capital B reading. When those two converged, you lost the capital A and the capital B. And that's what happens with each one of the steps along the Byzantine textual tradition, is you keep getting a loss of information, loss of information, loss of information. And like I said, most of the time, as far as we can tell, it wasn't active decision-making. It was usually just a matter of these groups are interacting. Now they're going to have to use something have something for official use. Here, use this. Okay, we're reading this. This is what is now official. There isn't a whole lot of evidence of real super decided decision-making where they said, we prefer this reading over this one. It's just, okay, now we're going to be reading from both Matthew and Luke for our liturgy. This group was always using Matthew. This group was always using Luke. Guess whose text we're going to use for each one? The people who have already been doing it. It doesn't take a whole lot of genius to figure that out. And of course, it's happening at different times in different places, but this is what we see. Initially, it's Byzantine elements. On the whole, it's not Byzantine. Then we get books and maybe even entire sections like the Gospels that are Byzantine, but not the New Testament as a whole. And then we see where the New Testament as a whole tends to be at least fairly Byzantine, but it doesn't have some of the elements that would show up later on. And some of the elements that would show up later on in particular manuscripts, usually a minority at that point, but it's still a part of the overall tradition, where they would pick up weird things, usually as a result of the Renaissance principles. The Renaissance, they loved going back to sources, but they also loved to compare and contrast with things that they had at the time. And so you get this weird combination of things. So you have the source material that they have being combined with things they already know, and you get some weird idiosyncratic readings from that. This is what Lake and Colwell were talking about when they said that the Byzantine manuscripts are the result of a converging set of textual traditions. What they were saying is that when we look at the earliest ones, they are less and less and less like what we get at the end. Okay, and this is what I pointed out in the first video, is that if you're talking about the majority text, one of the important questions is, at what time frame are you talking about? Because when we talk about this tradition of texts, you're going to get a different text at each one of these different periods. So if I stop at, say, in the 9th century, and I say, okay, I want the Byzantine textual tradition, and I want the majority of readings from the Byzantine textual tradition up through the 9th century, that's not going to include some of the idiosyncratic readings that show up later on, like 1 John 5:7 and those ones. And if I go with the earliest Byzantine text, where I actually get whole books that actually have a preponderance of Byzantine readings, where the majority of variant readings are in fact Byzantine readings, I'm still not going to have some of the elements that we like later on, like the woman caught in adultery. That doesn't show up that much. It doesn't show up that early. And so if we picked it from there, we wouldn't have it. The Byzantine text tradition varies throughout time, and it loses variation as it goes through time, and it also tends to pick up peculiar readings as it goes through time. Things that were not common earlier on suddenly become common after all. It tends to pick things up. You can kind of think of the Byzantine textual tradition as like a ship that's going through the ocean. Ships that have been out to sea for a while will eventually get barnacles that will start growing along the sides. And so from time to time, the sailors have to go and they have to scrape off the barnacles. And most of the time, they scrape off all of the barnacles. But what has happened is that from time to time, they'll leave a barnacle on there. And it will be on there for so long, and it grows to be such a big part of it, that it basically more or less becomes a part of the ship at that point. So a lot of the material is getting scraped off. A lot of the early variants that we see are getting trimmed down as time goes on, but there's a few prominent things that get attached that wind up becoming so popular, basically, that you can't scrape them off anymore because people aren't going to like it. But yeah, that's what we're talking about with converging textual traditions, and this is one of the reasons why people on my side, the critical text people, don't like that. Because, as we said, the result of a converging textual tradition is A, you're losing material. That is, the Byzantine textual tradition represents changes that get you further and further and further and further away from what you originally were. That's what we see. That's what a converging textual tradition is. You're losing your variance as time goes on. Okay, so that's one problem. It represents a deviation from what you had early on. Early on, it was mostly, in this example here, it was mostly capital letters that you had early on. At the end, you don't get any capital letters. It represents a departure from what you first had historically. And then the other major problem with the converging textual tradition that we talked about is that it changes basically by the century. If you say majority text, from what century are you talking about? Majority text from the roughly 5th century is not going to be the same as from the 9th century. It's not going to be the same as the 15th century. They each represent different forms of the text. It changes with time. That's the complaint that critical texters like myself have, is that if you pick this standard, what you're doing is you're picking something that is constantly changing, that's constantly in flux. And had the manuscript tradition continued by hand, who knows where we would have wound up? It's hard to know. But the one thing that we can be pretty sure of is that convergence is going to continue to change. We're going to continue to lose earlier readings, and we're going to pick up more and more idiosyncratic things that are idiosyncratic yet popular. All right, and then Van Bruggen had said that even though modern proponents of the critical text aren't greatly troubled by the idea that the majority text isn't the result of a recension, the fact that the majority text isn't the result of a recension does weaken the critical text position. Okay, that was his third main point, and frankly, it's not right. Okay, this does not weaken our position at all. Okay, and even at the time that the critical text was coming onto the scene, the idea of the recension didn't actually play that big of a part, and Van Bruggen himself actually admits that the recension idea was not the focal point of the critical text even to begin with. Okay, going all the way back to Hort, and Van Bruggen records this in his book on page 20, going all the way back to Hort, when the critical text was proposed as being superior to a majority text, the recension idea was something that came after the idea of historical priority. That is, critical texters have said that the tendencies that we see in the manuscripts are more likely than not representative of tendencies that existed in the textual stream as a whole. Now, we don't have the textual stream as a whole. We don't have every single text that was ever made. We just have the ones that survived. But critical texters have always maintained that the ones that we have that survived from each century are more or less representative of what came from that century. And if we see any trends and patterns in what is happening throughout those centuries in the manuscripts that we still have, that should be indicative to us of what we are to believe about the text. If the manuscripts themselves indicate that a change happened, then we should always try to reach back before the change happened in order to get to the most authentic form of the text that we can. If the textual tradition does not indicate that a significant change happened, then we don't. That was the original position of the critical texters, and the idea of the recension did come up, and even Hort came up with it. But it was just simply as a particular theory, and that's basically all that it ever wound up being, as to how a particular text could change in history, but it was always based on the manuscript evidence itself. Does the manuscript evidence indicate that there was a change? And then the recension idea came up as a way to explain that change. But it was the manuscript evidence itself that was always the leading thought for the critical texters. All right, but that still does leave an opening, and Van Bruggen does rightly point it out. He points out that critical text proponents like myself need to be able to account for how the majority text became generally accepted despite being unoriginal, at least on the whole, without the idea of a recension. And that is a fair point. If this, historically, do we see a deviation? And if so, how did it happen? And I dealt with this a lot more extensively in my video entitled Breaking the Majority Text. And I would suggest that you look up that video if you get the chance. But here's a really important point that I made in that video. And this is not a theory or speculation or based on, just this kind of half statement in a church father somewhere. This is based in generally known church history. In generally known church history, there's a few important things that are recorded for us. And they are the Western transition to using Latin manuscripts, the Roman moved Constantinople, their capital. It was in Rome. They wound up actually moving the capital to Constantinople. A lot of people don't actually know that. But the capital of Rome wasn't always Rome. During the later period of the Roman Empire, it actually shifted. And then another important historical event is the Islamic expansion. Now, this is part of a two-part explanation as to how the majority text became the majority. Within the tradition itself, we've already explained how that happened. It was a result of a convergent set of textual traditions. You have all these different groups that are not interacting with each other very much during persecution, because they're being persecuted. They can't interact very much. As they start to interact with each other, they start participating in formal worship together, and of course they're going to need to use some version of the text for formal worship. And so whatever version of the text that they happen to pick early on, right, wrong, or indifferent, is what's going to get used on down the line. And as these different groups start to coalesce, you wind up with a particular form of the text. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's the result of convergence. A lot of the early variation that you see gets left off in successive generations, and it keeps changing with each generation until you get to the point where you just have weird idiosyncratic things going on in the Renaissance period and things like that. Within that particular tradition, that's how it happened. A lot of it would be passive selection. It wouldn't be active selection. People saying, oh, I like this reading better than that one. And no, it's usually just a matter of, okay, in the service we're going to be reading from this book. Oh, here's a copy of that book. Okay, and that becomes the standard. A lot of times it wasn't very active in selection, but that's how within the tradition, it became popular. But then how did this one particular set of converging traditions, how did that come to dominate the Greek manuscript record? Well, it happens to do with where the Greek manuscripts come from in history. This is kind of a cutesy graph of the height of the Roman Empire. At one point in the history of Rome, they had a pretty good empire that included things like Asia Minor and Israel, Upper Egypt, North Africa, of course Italy, France, Spain. They would have different names at the time, and even the southern part of England. The Roman Empire covered a pretty good swath of land. And when Christianity was first arising on the scene, Greek was the language that the New Testament books were written in, and so early on, everybody used Greek. But that whole everybody uses Greek thing didn't last for a super long time. You see, in the West, they had already become accustomed to using Latin, and so when people were bringing in these Greek manuscripts, they would always have to be translated, which is actually really annoying. Okay, so we got one of Paul's letters in, and we want to read it to the church, so you have one guy reading it and basically another guy translating it, and so read a line, translate the line, hear the line. It gets kind of convoluted and awkward, and so pretty early on in the Latin-speaking West, they started translating a lot of the text into Latin, just because it was a lot simpler. Instead of having to go through this whole translation process, you just read it directly from a Latin text so that the Latin hearers can understand it, and you don't have to worry about the translation element. And because of that, we do not see a lot of Greek manuscripts coming from the Latin West after about the 4th or 5th century. That's where it pretty much dies off, where we have Greek manuscripts that are very Western in flavor. Okay, so let's go ahead and take that part of the map out. Okay, so the Latin-speaking West, after the 4th and 5th centuries, not producing a whole lot of Greek manuscripts. And they're producing Latin manuscripts instead. Now, at this same time period, in the 4th and 5th centuries, the central point of Roman government is moving. Up until this point, Rome, the city of Rome, had been the center of the Roman Empire. But in 330 AD, the Emperor Constantine moves the capital over to Constantinople, which is on a little isthmus between the Grecian Peninsula and Asia Minor. It's just a little dot on the map. But he moves the capital way over there. And this causes a change in Christianity itself. Early Christians, in fact the vast majority of God's people throughout history, believe that religion should have an active role in influencing government. And so early on, what you would get is these things called Christian sees. S-E-E. Well, S if you're doing the plural, sees. And what these were centers of Christian influence, and they would usually correspond to secular centers of Christian influence. So you had the See of Rome. And why that became a See of Christianity is pretty obvious. It was the center of the Roman Empire, so guess what the Christians are going to do? They're going to come alongside it and say, we want to make sure we're influencing you guys and your government properly. There was also the See of Alexandria. Alexandria was a major player in the ancient world, a very influential city in the ancient world, and so Christians would also congregate there and try to influence the culture as much as they could in this place. And then you have places like Antioch that were also Christian sees, so on and so forth. With the move of the Roman capital from Rome to Constantinople, though, what you had is the creation of a brand new See of Christianity as well. The political center moves, and so the Christian center moves alongside it. The Christians always believed that Christianity, the religion, should speak to the secular world and especially to secular government. They wanted to make sure they were keeping an eye on these people and making sure that these are people who are constantly hearing the message of the gospel and constantly hearing God's law, constantly having this stuff resonate in their ears to keep them on track as best as possible. And so you get the creation of a brand new see, and you can actually see this in the Christian records where they recognize Constantinople as a new see of Christianity. And so that means that Constantinople is now going to exert an influence over Christianity that it did not before. And like I said, this happened in 330 AD and moving forward. That this particular location would wind up influencing Christianity as a whole, and given that this was a Greek-speaking location, it would have a more profound effect upon other Greek-speaking Christians. So in the East, where Constantinople was, you're going to get all these Grecian groups starting to interact with Constantinople. And that influence is going to show up here and there in other groups. They're going to share texts. Their texts are going to interact, so on and so forth. And what's really interesting historically is that the very first church father that we have who actually uses a decidedly Byzantine text, not just a text that has Byzantine elements, but a decidedly Byzantine text, is the church father John Chrysostom. And where do you think, for those of you who are history buffs, you may already know this, but where do you think John Chrysostom preached? He was the bishop of what town? Constantinople. That's really interesting. We have the move to Constantinople for the seat of Roman government, which means that it becomes a new see of Christianity. And the first time we have the Byzantine text show up as truly and distinctly Byzantine, where it has Byzantine readings more often than not, is with an early church father by the name of John Chrysostom, who happened to be the bishop of Constantinople. Now, am I saying that John Chrysostom came up with the Byzantine text or something like that? No, I'm not. There's no historical evidence that would say that he came up with it on his own. As far as we can tell, it was a tradition that already existed in the area. But because of the new influence of the See of Constantinople, of that city as in the secular world and now in the Christian world, it wound up influencing other groups as well. But not necessarily a ton. Travel in the ancient world was still fairly limited. You're going to get some intermingling, but not a whole lot. So this starts back in the 4th century, where the See of Constantinople starts exerting some influence over the manuscripts of other regions. But the thing that really wound up having the biggest impact on the production of Greek manuscripts in the East was the rise of Islam. From the early 600s AD to the early 700s AD, there was about a century of Islamic expansion. Islam comes on the scene. Frankly, in its early form, was a very violent religion, and they went out conquering. And they conquered North Africa, they conquered Upper Egypt, they conquered Israel, they even conquered what is now modern-day Turkey. And frankly, Islam is not exactly good for the production of Greek manuscripts. Okay, and it's not to say that there weren't Greek manuscripts that were produced in Muslim lands. They were, but not nearly to the same volume as you would get in a non-controlled land. And certainly they would not have a whole lot of interaction with lands that were outside of Muslim control. They would be somewhat independent. So what you wind up having in history is only one region that is actually left producing Greek manuscripts in any great volume, and that is the Grecian Peninsula. And when you look through lists of Greek New Testament manuscripts and you look at their point of origin, the vast majority of them, literally thousands of the relatively few thousand Greek manuscripts that we have, the majority of them, relative to any other location, the majority of them come from the Grecian Peninsula, which is not surprising historically, because it was the only spot that was left that was producing Greek manuscripts, and within that peninsula you have a major sea of influence, Constantinople, that is going to make things more or less tend in a particular direction. Okay, so how do we, on the critical text side, explain how the Byzantine text became so popular? Basic history. Yeah, the Greek text was originally spread throughout the Roman world, but in the West, the Greek text wasn't super helpful because most of the people over there spoke Latin. So they started making translations pretty early on, and by the end of the 4th or 5th centuries, we don't really get a whole lot of Western Greek texts anymore. And then as far as what was going on in the East, you have a brand new sea of Christianity arising in the 4th century, and it's going to exert quite a bit of influence. And that new influence coming from Constantinople, combined with the fact that in the 7th and 8th centuries, most of the rest of Greeks speaking Christianity would be greatly restricted means that the only relatively unrestricted place that you have making Greek manuscripts anymore is the Grecian Peninsula, greatly influenced by Constantinople. So how do we explain the rise of the Byzantine text? It was basically the only group that was left producing manuscripts. And by the way, I didn't say this before, but the reason why it's called the Byzantine text and the Byzantine textual tradition is actually for Constantinople. Its other name, historically, is Byzantium. Byzantium, Byzantine, Byzantine text. That's where that name comes from. And it's not a historical accident that it's named that. It was made with the historical facts in mind. It's the only place that's left producing Greek manuscripts. What do you think the character of most Greek manuscripts is going to wind up being after all these other groups fall out of play? It's going to be whatever form was popular then. So let's compare that with the actual historical evidence that we have. This chart right here is a chart of the proportions, so it's not a count, but it's the proportions of non-Byzantine manuscripts to Byzantine manuscripts. The yellow is the non-Byzantine, and the reddish-brown is the Byzantine manuscripts. And by the way, the numbers down here at the bottom are the overall weighted percentages, because in each century they have different numbers of manuscripts, so you have to weight it according to how much was in each century. And for the first 9 centuries of Christian history, when we look at all the extant manuscripts that we have from there, the overwhelming majority, 71.1% of the manuscripts, are non-Byzantine. And by the way, this data comes from a journal article written by Daniel B. Wallace, who last time I checked is a part of Dallas Theological Theological Seminary. Sorry, forgot the word for seminary. And he was writing in the journal Jets, which I believe is the Journal of Evangelical Textual Studies or something like that. June 1994, specifically page 206 if you want to look it up. He didn't present this exact image. This is collected from the data that is in his image. But there it is. So what we have now, this is from Wallace's data, and Wallace dates manuscript A to the 5th century. Like I said, some people date it to the 4th century, some people date it to the 6th century. He kind of splits the middle on that one and puts it in the 5th century. That's why for him the Byzantine starts in the 5th century. But there are some people that would say that it would start in the 4th century, and historically I don't have any reason to disagree with that, because Constantinople became a major seat of Christianity in the 4th century, the earliest church father that we have that uses a truly Byzantine, truly majority type of text, at least as far as its basic elements would be concerned, also comes from the 4th century. It's late 4th century that John Chrysostom shows up on the scene, but still 4th century, so if you wanted to push it back to the 4th century, I wouldn't have any great complaints with that. But what we see is that early on, the majority of the manuscripts were not Byzantine. In fact, as far as distinctly Byzantine, not just having Byzantine elements here and there, but distinctly Byzantine, there wasn't anything that was distinctly Byzantine from the 2nd or 3rd century. It's at the earliest you could push it is the 4th century. If you wanted to be really strict about the datings, like Daniel Wallace was, 5th century. But even at that period of time, the Byzantine text doesn't exert an overwhelming influence. It does exert quite a bit of influence, sometimes close to 40% of the text from that particular century will be Byzantine, but it's still not the majority. It doesn't become the majority until the 9th century. And what is it that's happening between the 4th and 5th century cutoff points and the 9th century? Well, historically we just looked at that. 4th, 5th century is when Constantinople rises as a major seat of Christianity and, of course, political power in Rome. So you get a disproportionate influence at that point, but it doesn't really coalesce until all of the other Greek-speaking regions are put under the thumb of Islam. And then the only place that's left producing manuscripts in any great quantity is the area around Byzantium, the Grecian Peninsula. And so in the 9th century, after Islam has already conquered all these other areas, guess what happens? The majority suddenly shifts. It is now the Byzantine text. So why is the Byzantine text? Why did it become so popular? Despite being something that seems to have been produced more or less through a series of historical accidents? Well, because of a series of historical accidents, that's how it became popular. It wasn't... Okay, critical text proponents have pretty much completely abandoned the idea of an official recension that was forced upon everybody. Instead, it was just the historical circumstances of the time. The Western Empire stopped using Greek pretty early on because they all speak Latin over there. Greek manuscripts weren't very helpful. In the East, you have the rise of Constantinople, which exerts a disproportionate influence on the Greek manuscripts, but not enough to come over into the majority until the 9th century, when all those other areas are basically wiped out and all you have left is just the Grecian Peninsula. That would be our explanation, and it matches perfectly with the data that we have that's extant. Okay. The surviving manuscripts exhibit the exact pattern that the historical record itself predicts. The historical record predicts that you're going to see a rise in the number of manuscripts that come from Constantinople following the 4th century. That's what we see. And it's going to become the overwhelming majority in the 9th century because all of the other Greek-speaking regions are going to be under the thumb of Islam. So how do we explain it? Simply via the history. All right. Now, Van Bruggen actually presented things a little bit differently from how I'm doing here. She says that the convergence of the majority text must be explained, and we already went over what critical texters, even at the time, what Lake and Cowell meant when they said that the majority text represents a converging set of textual traditions. We already went over what that is. You have generally non-Byzantine manuscripts that have some Byzantine elements in them that through time keep getting combined eventually to form the Byzantine text at the end. But it's in that particular place, and a lot of it is very passive decision making. You have groups getting together, and whatever gets officially used, usually the first time that it gets officially used in a service with the groups together, that pretty much stays, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so a lot of material gets lost in that. We've already explained what convergence actually means historically and why it was critical text proponents who actually advanced the idea that the majority text is a convergent text rather than the result of a recension. But I did want to address Van Bruggen's explanation for a convergent text. His explanation, as he put it forward, was the theory that at the end of the Roman persecution of Christianity, that the Christians all basically said, well, we recognize that our manuscripts up to this point have become corrupted, so we're going to reach back for the oldest manuscripts we can find, and we're all going to reach back to that. And it was this general turning back of all the different Christian groups that eventually wound up in the Byzantine text. There is no evidence for that. Okay, I want you to notice the difference here. The critical text position, my text position, relies on manuscript evidence. Early on in the manuscript evidence, we see that there are not any distinctly Byzantine manuscripts for the first couple of centuries at least, maybe the first 3 extant centuries. And we also look at the historical facts. Early on, the text that was around Constantinople would not have it may have been there, but it would not have exhibited any great influence because early on, Constantinople wasn't a major see of Christianity. But when the Roman Empire moved its capital over to Constantinople, then yeah, it's going to start exhibiting some influence. And especially when Islam takes over pretty much everything else, and of course the Western people are over there doing their Latin thing, after those changes have taken place, then guess what? Constantinople, the Grecian Peninsula, they're the only people who are left making Greek manuscripts. And everybody in the Grecian Peninsula, guess where they're going to look for Greek manuscripts? They're going to look to Constantinople. That's the official see of Christianity. That's the critical text position. That's how we believe that that text became as popular as it was in Greek, because it was the only place left making Greek manuscripts. It's going to kind of do that by default. Our position is just simply, here's the history, here's the manuscript evidence that corroborates that, because that's exactly what happens in the manuscript evidence. 4th, 5th century, that's when you actually start seeing truly Byzantine texts show up, but they don't become the majority until the 9th century, which we'd expect because it's then that the Islamic conquest is over, and all those groups are going to kind of stop producing Greek manuscripts, at least in a great degree. So our position is, here's the history, here's the manuscript evidence that corroborates it. But Van Bruggen's position is, well, even though we don't have any evidence for this, we're going to say that all of the different Christian groups, or at least the vast majority of Christian groups, all simultaneously said, hey, we've got corrupted manuscripts. Let's go ahead and go throughout the world, scouring the world for the oldest forms of the text that we can find, and restore the original text. That is absurd on the most profound of levels. Okay, there is no evidence historically that this kind of a recension happened, and this is a type of recension, that this kind of recension happened any more than the Lucianic recension happened. Okay, at least the critical textures recognize that the Lucianic recension was a pretty stupid idea. Okay, when you take something that doesn't have really any good historical support and you try to say, oh, this is how it happened, Lucian made an official recension, it was forced on everyone, instead of, well, everyone decided that their manuscripts were bad, and all together decided to search for the earliest manuscripts that they had, and eventually wound up with this thing. It doesn't make any sense. It's not historical. Okay, there is no evidence that this kind of a general turning back happened. You look through most of the early records of the Christians from the 4th century, before the 4th century, after the 4th century, and most of the time they believed that the manuscripts, that whatever manuscripts that they had in front of them, were substantially correct. There were some of the early church fathers, like Origen, for example, that tended to be a little bit more suspicious, but on the whole, they usually trusted whatever manuscripts they had. That's not the tendency from history. The tendency from history is that they trusted what they have rather than distrusted it. There is no evidence that Christianity as a whole, in the 4th century and later, all suddenly decided, hey, we need to dig up some older manuscripts than the ones we got. Okay, that is how Van Bruggen explains the historical data, that when it comes to the earliest centuries, we don't have any Byzantine manuscripts whatsoever, and even clear up through the 8th century, they're not in the majority. How does he explain it? Well, I don't know how he gets all the way to the 8th century, it not being the majority, but at least through the 4th century, his explanation is, well, yeah, there was this divergence, but at the end of this period of divergence, this period of Roman persecution, everybody got the idea to start looking for old manuscripts. It's just a supposition. There's no history to back that up. Okay, what the critical text position is on how the Byzantine text type became so popular, that actually has historical merit and is backed up by the manuscript tradition as a whole. The two rather work hand in hand quite well, and is exactly what you'd expect. This, though, this isn't historical. This is not subject to historical evidence, and it seems to be attempting to make sense of the manuscript evidence, the fact that the early manuscripts are not generally Byzantine. But it is by supposing something that there is no historical evidence for. It's not accountable in any meaningful way. It's just, it's made up. It's a supposition. It's no better than the idea that, well, we think there was a recension and it must have been Lucian that made it. It's no better than that. At least the idea with Lucian, there were some quotes in church history that kind of sort of indicated that he may have made a recension of the Bible. Not very good evidence, but there's at least something there. But as for this, there's just nothing in the biblical, not in the biblical, but in the church history that would support it. It's just not there. Sorry, but it's not. So yeah, I was really disappointed when I got to this part of Van Bruggen's arguments, and I was sitting there reading this like, really, seriously, that's your best argument? And I personally hope that majority text advocates have progressed from Van Bruggen in this point, and they're not all saying, well, the reason why we don't have a whole lot of manuscripts from the early centuries that corroborate the Byzantine text is because most of them were the corrupted ones, but our guys, they reached back past all the corrupted ones to get the few good ones that were out there and based all their manuscripts on that. That's just ridiculous. It would be about as meaningful as me saying that I have a dragon that is in my pants pocket. But if you try to look inside my pants pocket, the dragon will magically teleport outside of my pants pocket into outer space. How could you possibly prove me wrong? Couldn't really. But at the same time, does what I'm saying make any sense? No. And on that basis alone, it's ridiculous. And it should not be put forward as a meaningful argument in a serious discussion of the biblical text. All right, section 3, textual criticism for the believing proponent of the critical text, part 2. All right, there's only a couple of points that I wanted to cover here. In the first video, I made several points about the critical text position relative to textual criticism as a whole. But here I just want to make two main points. First main point is that in keeping with the standard of consistency, which I discussed last time, which is that standards of truth don't change because God himself doesn't change. If something is a standard of truth here, and it really is a standard of truth, it ought to be a standard of truth when we're looking at the Bible and the biblical text. Okay, it can't change. All right, so in keeping with the standard of consistency, that standards of truth are consistent, whether you're talking about the Bible or not, a Christian ought to restrict himself to the historical data rather than making conjectures to account for his favorite readings. And yes, I'm specifically addressing what Van Bruggen just did. When Van Bruggen says, well, the way that we got the Byzantine text was the Christians in the 4th century and later all deciding to reach back to their oldest manuscripts all at the same time in different places. There is not a shred of historical evidence that would corroborate that. That is just a conjecture. Okay. And that is not a responsible thing to do. And frankly, you wouldn't do it in any other situation. And if you wouldn't do it in another situation, you shouldn't do it regarding the Bible. Here's an example of what I mean. In the case of Mormonism, there are actually many versions of the Book of Mormon, which is one of their key scriptures. They have a few different collections of scriptures, and the Book of Mormon is one of them. And there are several versions that are extant. And the early ones are not like the later ones. The early ones have a Sabellian understanding of God. And for those of you who don't know what Sabellianism is, it's modalism. And for those of you who don't know what modalism is an idea of God that denies the distinction of the persons. It says, yes, there's only one God, but the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are basically just different forms of that one same God. Different faces, if you will, different modes in which this one God interacts with us. That's the basic idea behind Sabellianism, modalism. Now, technically, there's variations within that as to exactly what it means. But basically, it conflates the persons. There's a sense in which the Father is the Son, and the Son is the Holy Spirit, so on and so forth. The early versions of the Book of Mormon show a tendency towards that. But later versions of the Book of Mormon seem to have been edited to be more polytheistic, whereas early versions would often conflate, especially the Father and the Son, with each other. Later versions would start distinguishing them, which would fit what would happen with Joseph Smith. He started eventually preaching polytheism down the road. And so for us as Christians on the outside looking in, we'd say, well, you have several different versions of the Book of Mormon that early on were not going in the direction of polytheism. Instead, they were going in the direction of Sabellianism. The polytheistic elements don't show up in the early versions, they show up in the later versions. We would say that this is evidence of change. That something in the system changed, and it is a deviation from what was original. Joseph Smith originally, as far as we can tell, historically, based on the historical evidence, wasn't a polytheist. He eventually became one, but originally he was a Sabellian. He was a modalist. Like actually a lot of people who call themselves Christians are, unfortunately. A lot of people are functionally modalists. They don't properly distinguish distinguish between the persons of the Trinity. That's a pretty common error, actually. A lot of people don't think about it a whole lot, haven't actually processed what the doctrine of the Trinity actually is and isn't, and have actually been in a position where they've actually truly had to defend it and explain it in any kind of thorough way. They just haven't. So in their own mind and their own concept, without having the benefit of having done a whole lot of reading on it, been taught about it, and having to defend it, they kind of wind up defaulting to Sabellianism/modalism. And Joseph Smith seems to have done the exact same thing. It was only in later versions that he became a polytheist, and the versions of the Book of Mormon wound up reflecting that later on. In that particular case, we would say early versions are like this, later versions are not like this. There was a change here. What came later is not as indicative of what was original as the early versions are. Most of my majority text friends would be okay with using that kind of evidence in speaking to a Mormon, that Joseph Smith's understanding of God changed. It's a fair point, they would say. If it's a fair point to bring up to Mormons, I'm not saying that this is the ultimate proof that Mormonism is wrong or anything like that. Both myself and a lot of my majority text friends would not say that that is the ultimate proof of that kind of a thing. But we would both agree that that is a fair and just point. If you see historical change, then that is evidence that there was in fact real change at the time. The historical evidence that we have now, provided that it's reasonably trustworthy evidence, is going to be more indicative than not of what was actually happening. We would do that with Mormonism. Why don't we do that with the New Testament manuscripts? The historical evidence that we have in the manuscripts themselves from the different periods indicate that there was a changeover from a non-Byzantine text to a Byzantine text, which means that the Byzantine text is not going to be as indicative of what was original as the non-Byzantine texts are, just as we would do with the Book of Mormon. The early and late versions of the Book of Mormon have some very interesting and very distinct differences between them, and we would say that the earlier ones are going to give us a better understanding of what was actually taught and believed in early Mormonism versus later Mormonism. If we do it there, we should do it in another place. Standards of truth, if there actually are standards of truth, are going to be consistent. A similar case, no, not exactly the same, would be in Islam. There are early records in Islam, not necessarily a whole lot of manuscripts. A lot of early manuscripts in Islam don't exist. But there are early records in Islam that indicate that there were differing numbers of surahs in the Quran. And the surah, a surah is kind of like a chapter is for us. It's basically a section of the Quran, roughly equivalent to what a chapter would be for us in the English Bible. And I'm not saying that the Quran and the Bible are all alike or even comparable. They're not. One is actually God's Word and the other one isn't. And they also come from very different cultures, very different backgrounds, very different methods of composure, etc., etc. But the point is that there are early records that say that the numbers of surahs in the Quran, at least at one time for certain people, were different from the standard version of the Quran that exists today. And most Christians, majority texters included, would feel that this is fair game to point out to Muslims. That this is a fair point to make, that they shouldn't be too adamant about the versions that they currently have, which is the post-Uthmanic versions of the Quran. And to give you a little bit of backstory on that one, the Muslims, after Muhammad died, the Muslims entered a period where they had the Quran only in oral form, and that's how Muhammad delivered it. He didn't write it down. He spoke it and would have them recite it, and that's what Quran literally means. It's recitation. It means to recite. And so they had this period where Muhammad wasn't around anymore, and the only version that the Quran existed in was basically oral form. And there were, of course, some people that wrote portions down that they knew, but there wasn't any official version early on, and people would debate about what actually was in it and what isn't, depending on how they happen to remember it. And there was also a lot of early fighting in early Islam. Remember that Muslim expansion I talked about? There's about 100 years of warfare there. And a lot of Muslims died in that warfare, including people who had memorized the Quran. And so you would actually have the potential, at least, that parts of the Quran could be lost because the people who remember those particular parts are now dead. So that's not good. So under the third caliph of Islam, basically the third head honcho, named Uthman, they decided to gather together all the versions of the Quran that existed at the time, and they did have writing forms at this time. And like I said, even early on there were a few written forms, but for the most part it was recited and then got put into writing. And then under Uthman, they took it all together, made an official version, and then burned everything that they could that wasn't in keeping with that official version. And what we have historically is people who recorded that there were different numbers of surahs that there were supposed to be there, and particularly ones that recorded that there were supposed to be more surahs than what wound up in the official Uthmanic version. And we as Christians would look at Muslims and say, well, there is some early evidence, and fairly good early evidence, that would say that maybe you guys don't have it all. And you should be careful about saying what you do and do not have because of that. If it's a fair point there to point out history that is relatively representative and relatively reliable, then why wouldn't it be with the Bible? If it's a standard of truth, it should be able to be applied consistently. And if it can't be applied consistently, it's not a standard of truth. And that's my point here. So doing what Van Bruggen did in creating a conjecture to explain how we get the Byzantine text that has no basis in history or even in the manuscript data, except for some very basic points that early on we don't have Byzantine text. That's about as much as he would agree with at this point. As far as that goes, it's just inconsistent with how Van Bruggen would probably deal with other groups when it comes to similar issues with their texts. If you can't apply the standard consistently, no. It's not a standard of truth. Okay, and this is why critical text proponents say that the Byzantine text type represents a deviation, and it does historically represent a deviation, both within the manuscript history and within the history in general, what was happening. The Western transition to Latin, the move of the Roman capital to Constantinople, the conquering of former Christian lands by Muslims, all of that happens to come together to point out that what was once a minority text became a majority text through a series of historical factors that in and of themselves cannot guarantee that this is the original text. This once was minority, and it became majority later on. And that majority actually even shifts within its own tradition. It represents a deviation from what was common. It represents a change. And that is why critical texters on the whole don't trust the majority text. That doesn't mean that there aren't particular parts of the majority text that may indeed be authentic, and I talked about that in the last video. But on the whole, we recognize that the majority text represents a deviation from what was common prior to that. And it's coincident with how we would treat other books and other historical records. I'm not saying that the Book of Mormon is actually a historical record, but I'm saying a record that shows up in history and statements about that particular record that show up in history. And the same thing with the Quran. Alright, so that's the first main point I wanted to get across, is that whatever our standards are, they need to be consistent. And that includes being subject to historical evidence and the manuscript evidence itself. Alright, my second main point, which is also in keeping with the standard of consistency, doing things consistent across the board. If we would use it as a standard here, we ought to be able to use it over here, and vice versa. There is the one major canon of textual criticism that exists right now. And that one canon to rule them all, basically, is that the reading which best explains the rise of the other in all pertinent regards, which includes chronology and majority, the one that best explains the other in all pertinent regards is most likely to be correct. Let me show you what I mean. Which text of the two that I'm going to put up here would you say is the copy of the other? And this is assuming that the original correct, which a believing textual scholar that I'm trying to represent here, a believing textual critic, this would be an assumption that they have, that what was originally given was correct. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that what was originally given was grammatically correct according to our standards of grammatically correct. So, understand that. But what God originally inspired the authors to write was what he meant for them to write. Okay. So here are two texts. I'm not telling you which one was written first. I'm not telling you how popular each one is. But just here are two texts. Which one do you think is the copy of the other? First text is, I will go home and feed all my cats. Or the other version is, I will go home and feed all my cats. Okay. You don't know which one was written first. You don't know which one's the most common. But based simply on what you have there, would you be able to tell me which one you think was the copy of the other? I bet you would. You would probably say that the first one was a bad copy of the second one. You would say that since there's that word all in there, it generally means that there's supposed to be a plural. That's how we use it. The word all in English it's for more than one, certainly. And so if you say that you're going to go home and feed all of your whatever, we would expect it to be in the plural. And so in English, it would make sense that all my cat would be incorrect as long as we suppose that the original was correct. Like I said, when it comes to the Bible, saying that things were correct grammatically, you wind up with some problems with that. And because of that, things have to get a little bit more advanced in how you look at them, because their standards of grammar and our standards of grammar aren't necessarily the same. And the standards of Greek grammar change throughout time, like all languages do, and so you have to account for that. But this is just a simple explanation to point out that sometimes with certain variants, you actually don't need to know a whole lot of external information about them. Seeing what the variants are and knowing a little bit about how something works relative to that language or relative to the manuscripts, etc., is usually more than enough to say, yeah, that one explains the rise of the other one, so that one's the one that's original. Okay? It makes sense that the person would originally say, I will go home and feed all my cats. It doesn't make sense that the original person would say, I will go home and feed all my cats. Okay? I know how the English language works at this particular time and place. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's impossible that they said the other one first. You could have someone who would say, I will go home and feed all my cat. But assuming that they were writing within the norms of the time and were correct according to the norms of the time, that's what you would pick. Let me show you an example in the Bible that's like that, but I personally believe is a little bit more clear than this one is. Alright, so as I said, the overarching canon for textual criticism right now is that the variant that best explains the others is the most likely to be correct. In Luke 2:14, there are two main readings. There's a sub-reading or two in there, but there's two main readings. In Luke 2:14, you'll have translations that will say, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men, the men being general, and the peace being general, basically peace to all the earth, goodwill toward men, goodwill toward all the men on the earth. So in some translations, it'll be a very general statement, but then in some it will be much more specific. It'll say, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests, speaking of God. That is the peace is for a particular group, and it's the favored group. And that sounds like a pretty big difference in English, but in the underlying Greek text, it's actually the difference of a single letter. The readings are either eutakia or eutakias, respectively, for each reading. Okay, single letter. Let's see if I can highlight it here. It looks like a C in English. It's actually not a C. It's a final sigma. And in the ancient manuscripts, the final sigmas did look like C's. And just based on that difference alone, it's really hard to know which one is original, because both of those are technically words. Eudokia is a word, eudokios is a word. And grammatically, with the rest of the sentence, they both actually fit. It's not like in the example that we just had, where you had a singular and plural, and that cued you in that something was wrong. Here, either one of these fits. But if you look at the older manuscripts, you'll notice a really weird habit of the scribes when they would come to a word that was at the end of a line, but just had a few letters left on it. They would do weird things with it. Let me show you here. This is in Codex B, Codex Vaticanus. It's from the 4th century, and this is John 1:1. You can read along if you want. In arche, ein ha, logos, kai ha logos, ein proston theon. So, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. But read through John 1:1. This actually gets into John 1:2. So I should have labeled that John 1:2. It's John 1:1 and 1:2 going into 1:2. But in John 1:2, you have the word hutas, and you'll notice the final sigma looks like a C, but it's sigma. It's actually a lot smaller than the rest of the letters. And you can see another sigma over here right before hutas. That's a normal size sigma. This sigma that I put a little purple line right under so that you can more easily see it, it is absolutely tiny. What happened is the scribe is riding along, and they're just getting close to the end of the line, and normally what the scribes would do is if they had a word that was too long for the line, they would just continue the word on the next line. That was really common. But here he's really, 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 really close to being finished with the word. He's only got one letter left. So either he can take the sigma down onto the next line, and then you just have one letter hanging there from the last word, which is really awkward. And so he just writes it really small so that he can fit everything on the line, and then begins a completely different word on the next line. And frankly, I've done very similar things. When I've handwritten letters to people, or reports, or essays, or whatever the case happens to be, sometimes as I start getting to the end of the line, it's in the middle of the word and it's a very long word, so I'll put a little dash and continue the word on the next line. But if I've just got one or two letters that are hanging off the end, I'll just make it really, really, really small to fit on the end of the line, and then begin a new word on the next one. I've done that, I admit it. Well, it turns out that the ancient scribes did the same thing. So here's one example in Codex B, Codex Vaticanus. Here is another one in Codex Aleph, also known as Codex Sinaiticus. This is also from John 1:1. Technically, I think this one also goes into John 1:2 as well. Yeah. So, yeah, that happens as well. Yeah, utas, there it is. Yeah, so it begins in John 1:1. But here, we get in arche ein halag. And when I was first reading this, because I actually have a copy of Codex Sinaiticus back at my apartments, and in first reading this line, it's actually really weird, because you read all the other letters, they're all normal size, and you get to log, and you expect it to be logos for the word was God, and the beginning was the word. You expect that, but it doesn't continue os on the next line, it's just log. And then I noticed in really, 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 really tiny print by comparison, and without drawing the purple line under it, it actually looks kind of like a smudge. And the first time I read it, I thought it was just a smudge. So it was in arche ein halag. And that really confused me, because that's not John 1:1. And there's actually no Greek word log. It's supposed to be logos. And then I started looking at it and got, look at it a little bit more carefully, and found out there's the two little letters that are right there next to the main word. And oh, it's logos. But if you're just reading it quickly, you don't necessarily see it, and I didn't. And what cued me into it is that log is not a word in Greece. Not in Greece, but in Greek. It's a word in English, falling off a log, things like that. But in Greek, log is not a word. And so that cued me in that there was a problem here. But if you're talking about a word like, or a set of words like eudokia versus eudokios, both of those are words. If I don't have the final omicron sigma of logos, that's not a word anymore, and it lets me know, hey, something's up here, I need to pay more attention. Oh, that thing that looks like a smudge, that's actually two letters. That's kind of important. But if you're just reading through quickly and the thing makes sense by itself, those little letters can be easily dismissed as smudges. And some of the early manuscripts weren't overly clean. They kind of got quite a bit smudged up. And so you could really see mechanically why somebody would leave off a final sigma. So just based on that evidence alone, not knowing which one of these is the majority reading, which one of these is the earliest reading, etc., we can see a mechanical reason for why a scribe would leave off a final sigma. There is actually a reason for it. Sometimes when they got to the end of a line and they would sometimes want to fit the whole word on that line, so they just make the next letter or two really small. That's how you could miss a letter like this. So this isn't, a nefarious scribe saying, oh, we don't like this doctrine, so we're going to pick this doctrine instead. We don't like the idea that there will be peace for all mankind and goodwill towards everyone. Just for particular people, and that's the way we want it to read, or vice versa. God doesn't love just a few people, he loves everyone. Now, nothing nefarious about it. It's just copying along, happening not to notice that thing that looks like a smudge is actually a letter going on. Nothing nefarious about it whatsoever. So which one is original? Eudokios. Okay, without having to know which one is the most common, which one's the majority text, without knowing which one is the one that shows up the earliest, you can make a really good assessment as to what was original here based simply on which one explains the rise of the other. If it was originally Eudokios and it wound up being at the end of a line in some manuscript, you'll get the scribe writing that last sigma, or perhaps the last couple of letters, but probably just the final sigma, really small. Next scribe doesn't see it, and it becomes Eudokia. That's the one that explains the rise of the other. If this is the one that began it, we have a mechanical reason for why Eudokia would be the result of Eudokios. But we don't have any mechanical reason for why Eudokios would be the result of Eudokia. Okay. This is the one that best explains the rise of the other. That's the one that should be taken as original. Now, you can suppose about the doctrine and theology all you want, but that's assuming that you know what the predilections of those particular scribes at that particular time would have been, and frankly, we don't know that. We don't know if the particular scribes at the time where this transition took place, either from majority to minority or minority to majority. Okay, I'm not telling you which one's which. If you look it up in a few different versions, English translations, you'll figure out which one it is. But right now I'm not telling you exactly where that transition was. And frankly, we don't know if they were Arminians or Calvinists or what their predilections were. You don't. Okay, and even if you know what was generally happening in the area, you don't know about the specific scribes. We cannot reach back and say, this is what they would have thought about this, or this would have been their doctrine and theology. We don't know. And so when it comes to issues like this, looking for mechanical reasons and not assuming that they're going through to try to intentionally change the manuscripts is usually a much safer bet. Like I said in the convergence of the Byzantine text, textual scholars don't generally think that was the result of an intentional recension where people are actively comparing manuscripts and saying, I like these readings more than those ones. No, most of the time, as far as we can see, it was just simply a matter of groups interacting with each other and having to pick something for official use, and whatever happened to get picked for official use was what they wound up with. We don't impute nefarious intent to them, mostly because we don't know what their intents were, good or bad. Our assumption is that most scribes were probably just trying to copy the text. They probably weren't overly concerned with things one way or the other. They were just doing the best with what they had. And we have a mechanical reason here for why a final sigma could get dropped that doesn't require us to assume that we know anything about these people historically, do long-distance psychoanalysis of them, evaluate their doctrine and theology. We don't know those kinds of things about them. We can suppose all we want, but we don't know those kinds of things. But here we have mechanical reasons for why this could happen, relatively objectively speaking, and so without even knowing which one's the majority reading, which one's the minority reading, all that, which one came earlier, which one came later, we have a good reason to say that Eudokios explains the rise of Eudokia. shows up at the end of the line, that final segment gets written small, next scribe doesn't see it, it becomes Eudokia. The reverse, we don't have any mechanism for that, so that one's unlikely. Okay, the variant that best explains the rise of the other, or others, in all pertinent regards, is most likely to be correct. Now, if I wanted to, I can combine this with a lot of the external data as to which one is majority and which one is earlier, and that would turns out that it actually confirms what I've already said here. I won't necessarily say how, but it does confirm what I've said here. You can probably guess. But that is the overarching principle that textual scholars now make. There's lots of canons in the past, and there's still a few canons that people will talk about, you know, the briefer reading, the harder reading, those kinds of things. But the overarching canon that textual critics now use, that kind of make use of everything else, is that the reading that best explains the rise of the others is the one that is most likely to be correct. And yes, that does include an evaluation of external information, certainly, and I've already talked about that. Okay, when it comes to the external information, in general, we would not trust the majority text because it does represent a deviation. Historically, that's the case. As far as the manuscript evidence, that's the case. Generally speaking, we would not trust it. That doesn't mean that specific parts of the Byzantine text can't be correct, though. And I talked about that in the first video as well. And in cases, especially in cases like this where there's actually mechanical reason to believe that one should be favored over the other, we wouldn't have any great problem in saying, yeah, go with that one. That makes more sense. All right, so that's the end of what I have to talk about. It's probably been quite a little while. Let me see. Yeah, about 2 hours. That's pretty good. All right, so been 2 hours talking about the text of the New Testament. Always good as usual. And I hope that you guys understand the point here. I know that this time I was probably a little bit not as organized as I could have been in my thought processes, and I apologize for that. But hopefully you guys got the points that I was trying to make in comparison to Van Bruggen. To recap it real quick, Van Bruggen's overall arching point was that the majority text was not the result of a single recension by Lucian. My rebuttal to that is that critical text proponents such as myself would completely agree with him. That is not how we explain the majority text. How we explain the majority text is that it is the result within a particular region of a convergence of texts and through fairly natural processes, not anything nefarious, but just you have these groups that come together. The groups are going to have to use something, whatever they wind up using. That's kind of settle things going forward. And different points of variation wind up becoming fixed as time goes on through that in that particular region. And then as far as how the text from that particular region, from that particular set of traditions wound up influencing everything else, well, the history explains that pretty well. In the West, they abandoned Greek pretty early on. The Roman Empire itself moved its capital over to Constantinople, so the text that was popular in that region is going to wind up exerting a lot of influence on other regions. And then a lot of the other Greek-speaking regions wind up getting conquered by Islam, so they weren't producing their own texts anymore. And that's what we see lived out in the New Testament manuscripts themselves. Early on, we don't see any truly Byzantine text. We see some text with Byzantine elements, like P45, but we don't see any truly Byzantine texts until at the earliest 4th century. A lot of people would say 5th century, but I'm okay with 4th. I see that there's sufficient evidence to at least posit that it was available then. But as far as any great numbers, probably not until the 5th century. And clear up through the 8th century, what would become the majority text wasn't in the majority. And that makes sense. Yes, Constantinople is now a major see of Christianity, starting in the 4th century, but other regions are still producing Greek texts of their own, so it's not going to come into preponderance. It's going to exert a disproportionate effect on the manuscripts as a whole, but it's not going to become the majority quite yet. In order for it to become the majority, you're going to have to shut down these other areas that are producing Greek manuscripts, and that's exactly what the Muslim expansion does. That happens in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Muslim expansion, and so it's only in the 9th century and later that you see the majority text actually becoming the majority text. this text that was associated with Constantinople and the Grecian peninsula as a whole. Okay, that's how we explain it. Okay, Van Bruggen's claim was, well, the critical text guys, they don't have the recension anymore, so how are they going to explain it? Well, our explanation is basically what you've already admitted, that the majority text is a converging textual tradition that wound up changing with time, and it wound up leaving off a lot of information with time. A converging textual tradition eliminates variance. It doesn't preserve variance. And that's what's happening in the particular region, and then what's going on in the broader history explains the rest of it. That's how we explain the rise of the Byzantine text. And the observed historical fact is that the Byzantine text represents a change. The growing popularity of the Byzantine text represents a change from what was popular early on. And because of that, we are going to be more skeptical of it. That doesn't mean that we're completely skeptical of it, but we are more skeptical of it. It doesn't mean that it's going to completely be wrong in every detail, but it's not going to be as good as reaching back before that period of transition and trying to use as much of that material as possible. And I talked about this in another video that I put out there, which is called something like Kitchen Magnets and Biblical Manuscripts or something like that. And I would suggest that you look up that as well. And my point in there was basically the same. I looked over things like KJV onlyism, versional onlyism. I looked at the majority text ecclesiastical text position and the critical text position in comparing them to something else. If it's a standard of truth, it should be a standard throughout, and I happen to use a kitchen magnet that had some information printed on it, and basically said that the majority is going to be more correct than something that's idiosyncratic like KJV onlyism, but it's still not going to be as good as going with the best evidence available, because the majority of evidence might not be all that useful for various reasons. In the case of the New Testament, the reason why the majority of evidence is not going to be as useful as a lot of the earlier evidence is because the majority of evidence is associated with one particular region, and that is the Grecian peninsula as greatly influenced by Constantinople. Okay, it doesn't mean that everything that they had in Greece, especially later on, was completely wrong or anything like that, and it doesn't mean that they don't have any original readings or anything like that, but it does mean that it's just one particular voice that wound up having a disproportionate voice later on. But early on, it was not the only voice, and I want to be able to look at what everyone was saying early on. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, including my majority text friends, like I said, a lot of majority texters, we would agree on God, the gospel, all the essentials of the faith, even the essentials of what would constitute Reformed theology. I'm not speaking of theology in general, but particular Reformed distinctives. A lot of my majority text friends would agree with me even on those details. We have a lot in common. We are brothers and sisters in the Lord, and I don't want this to become a point that divides churches or anything like that. And so to all those people, I say, go with God and be blessed. And if you still want to be a majority texter at the end of this, okay, that's up to you. But at least let's have the conversation and make sure that we understand what the other side's position is so that we can represent it and interact with it fairly. So for those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. And for those of you who are not, okay, you just happen to stumble across this in internet land and you're like, wow, these Christians are talking about some weird, interesting things. For those of you who are not in Christ, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.